What if you were born into a world where your life had no value? A world where your labor was nothing more than a commodity to be exploited for profit. The Congo Free State was just such a place, a terrifying reality for millions of people living in the heart of Africa. Today, we will uncover the horrors of the Congo Free State, a period of human history that should never be forgotten. In the late 19th century, a brutal dictator took control of what was, at the time, the vast, untamed land of the Congo. King Leopold II of Belgium claimed this land as his own private territory, under the pretense of bringing civilization and humanitarian efforts to the region. In reality, what followed was a reign of terror that left millions dead and an entire population decimated. In this video, we will explore the horrifying conditions that the Congolese people endured under Leopold's rule. From the forced labor in the rubber trade to the horrific punishments meted out to those who couldn't meet their quotas, the Congo Free State was a place where brutality was commonplace and human lives meant nothing. How did the world stand by as such horrors unfolded? What drove an entire nation of people to the edge of extinction? And how did this dark chapter in history continue to impact the world for generations? Let's delve into the true story of the Congo Free State, one of the darkest episodes in modern colonial history. The Congo Free State was a colony like no other. It was not a colony controlled by a country like other territories in Africa, but rather the personal possession of one man, King Leopold II of Belgium. In 1885, after years of political maneuvering and manipulation, Leopold was granted control of the Congo. What was supposed to be a humanitarian mission, aimed at bringing civilization to Central Africa, quickly turned into a nightmare of exploitation and suffering. Leopold's primary motivation was greed. Despite being a monarch of Belgium, a relatively small European power, he wanted to prove his worth as a king and gain international prestige by creating a colony that would generate immense wealth. He found his target in the Congo, a land rich in natural resources, especially rubber, which was in high demand in Europe and the US at the time. To disguise his true intentions, Leopold marketed the Congo Free State as a philanthropic project. He promised to build schools, hospitals, and protect the native population from the ravages of the slave trade. This propaganda was convincing enough that world powers like Britain and France were willing to let him take control without interference. But Leopold's promises were empty. From the very beginning, his regime was driven by the extraction of wealth, and the Congolese people became the tools to achieve that end. Leopold established a system of forced labor, particularly in the rubber industry, which would become the hallmark of his reign. The lives of millions would be destroyed in the process. The exploitation of the Congolese people was systematic, ruthless, and all-encompassing. Leopold's regime forced the population into labor that was unimaginably brutal. Rubber trees were tapped, and ivory was collected, all under horrific conditions. The Congolese were forced to meet rubber quotas that were virtually impossible to achieve. Villages were held accountable for these quotas, and entire communities were subjected to violence when they failed. The punishment for not meeting the quotas was often death, mutilation, or being held hostage to make families comply. To enforce these quotas, Leopold employed a force known as the Force Publique, a brutal militia made up of soldiers who would strike terror into the hearts of the Congolese. The Force Publique would often resort to horrific tactics to instill fear. One of the most notorious practices was the cutting off of hands. When soldiers found that workers had not met their rubber collection quotas, they would amputate the hands of the workers or their family members as a warning to others. There are countless reports from missionaries and others who witnessed these acts of brutality. This grotesque practice was not just for punishment. It was also used as a method of tracking bullets. Soldiers would collect hands as proof that they had killed or punished someone in their efforts to maintain control. These hands were counted, and the more hands a soldier collected, the more they were rewarded. The economic system was based entirely on exploitation. The Congolese were denied any real ownership of their land or resources. They were forced to gather rubber, not for their benefit, but for Leopold's personal wealth. It is estimated that, during this time, millions of Congolese died due to overwork, disease, and violence. As the atrocities in the Congo Free State escalated, whispers began to spread beyond the borders of Africa. Missionaries, explorers, and traders who visited the Congo started to report the horrors they witnessed. But for many years, Leopold was able to control the narrative and suppress any information that threatened his carefully crafted image as a benevolent ruler. One of the earliest whistleblowers was E.D. Morel, a British shipping clerk who became outraged by the flow of weapons and supplies into the Congo and the absence of any goods leaving for the local population. Morel began to speak out, publishing articles that exposed Leopold's exploitation of the Congolese people. His work led to the creation of the Congo Reform Association in 1904, which advocated for the abolition of Leopold's control. Another key figure was Roger Casement, an Irish diplomat who was sent by the British government to investigate the situation in the Congo. His report, published in 1904, confirmed the widespread abuse and helped bring international attention to the plight of the Congolese. Despite these reports, Leopold and his supporters worked tirelessly to suppress the truth. He used his political influence to ensure that his atrocities were downplayed or ignored by the European powers, but the growing international pressure eventually led to a change. By 1908, Leopold was forced to hand over control of the Congo to the Belgian government, though the exploitation did not end with his departure. What was daily life like for the Congolese living under Leopold's rule? The Congo Free State was not just a place of economic exploitation. It was a place where life itself was cheap, and survival depended on constant submission to an unforgiving system. Men, women, and even children were forced into the labor camps, where they spent long hours in the jungle, collecting rubber and ivory. The conditions were unbearable. Workers had to endure tropical diseases like malaria, sleeping sickness, and dysentery without any medical help. Families were torn apart as men were sent away to work in the rubber camps, while women and children were left behind to fend for themselves. Food was scarce, and those who failed to meet their quotas faced severe punishments. The Congo Free State's government system was built on terror. One survivor, a man who was forced to work in the rubber camps, recalled how the villagers would hide their children when soldiers came to collect them for forced labor. Some people even died trying to escape the brutal camps, knowing that their families might face even worse punishment for their disobedience. The cost of the Congo Free State, in terms of human lives, is staggering. While exact numbers are difficult to determine, estimates suggest that between 10 and 15 million people perished under Leopold's regime. This makes it one of the deadliest episodes of the 19th century, a genocide of unimaginable proportions that occurred in the heart of Africa. The reasons behind such a staggering death toll are multifaceted. The most direct cause was the forced labor in the rubber and ivory industries. Workers were subjected to inhuman conditions, long hours, malnutrition, disease, and constant fear. Entire villages were decimated, either by the violence of the force publique or by the deadly diseases that ravaged the region, from sleeping sickness to smallpox. But the death toll was not just the result of direct violence. The population was driven to starvation by the collapse of local economies, as traditional ways of life were replaced by Leopold's exploitative system. The people of the Congo were denied the ability to feed themselves, and they watched helplessly as their families were torn apart by disease, violence, and poverty. The long-term effects of this genocide are still felt today. The population of the Congo was severely diminished during Leopold's rule, and the country's infrastructure and social fabric were shattered. Those who survived had to rebuild their lives under Belgian colonial rule, which continued to oppress the Congolese people, albeit in a different form. The legacy of the Congo Free State is profound. The exploitation of the Congolese people under Leopold's regime laid the foundation for decades of inequality and underdevelopment in the region. It also set a terrifying precedent for how colonial powers treated the people they dominated, viewing them not as human beings, but as mere resources to be extracted and discarded. The scars of the Congo Free State still affect the Democratic Republic of the Congo today, where poverty, corruption, and violence remain endemic. The lack of economic development, the presence of armed groups, and the struggles for natural resources are all rooted in the exploitation that began under Leopold. Though the world has changed, The Congo continues to bear the weight of a legacy built on cruelty and greed. Despite the overwhelming violence and cruelty of Leopold's regime, it did not last forever. Eventually, international pressure forced him to cede control of the Congo to the Belgian government in 1908. But was this really an end to the exploitation? Or was it simply a shift from one form of colonial oppression to another? The final collapse of the Congo Free State came after years of growing international scrutiny. The reports of atrocities from individuals like E.D. Morel and Roger Casement were vital in raising awareness. These brave individuals risked their own safety to expose the truth, and their actions eventually turned public opinion against Leopold's regime. As pressure mounted, Leopold was forced to relinquish his personal control of the Congo in 1908, but the Belgian government took over the territory. While Leopold's reign of terror officially ended, the exploitation did not. Belgian colonial rule continued for another 50 years, and although the Belgian government made some reforms, they still maintained a system of forced labor and economic extraction. The Congolese continued to live under harsh conditions, though there was no longer the same level of overt violence as under Leopold. Still, many of the systems of exploitation, corruption, and neglect persisted, leaving a legacy of poverty, inequality, and political instability. Leopold's personal involvement in the Congo Free State ended in 1908, but the harm he caused would leave a permanent mark on the country. Despite the promises of better governance, the exploitation continued under Belgian rule, which would not end until the country's independence in 1960. The story of the Congo Free State is one of the most horrifying chapters in the history of colonialism. King Leopold II's personal control over the region turned the lives of millions of Congolese into a nightmare of suffering, mutilation, and death. It's hard to comprehend the scale of the horrors that took place, and even harder to grasp how the international community allowed it to continue for so long. Today, the scars of Leopold's reign can still be seen across the Congo. The exploitation, the violence, and the legacy of colonialism left deep wounds that have not yet healed. While the Belgian government officially took control in 1908, the long-term effects of the Congo Free State are still felt in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the people continue to struggle against poverty, corruption, and the exploitation of their resources. It's essential to remember this history, not just for the sake of the millions of lives lost, but also to ensure that the same mistakes are not repeated. The story of the Congo Free State serves as a stark reminder of the brutal realities of unchecked power and the exploitation that often comes with colonialism. The legacy of Leopold II is one of horror, but it is also one of resistance, as the Congolese people fought to survive, to rebuild, and to eventually gain their independence. As we reflect on this dark history, we must continue to ask ourselves, what can we learn from the suffering of the Congolese people? How can we ensure that such a tragedy is never repeated? The Congo's past is deeply painful, but it's also an important part of our collective memory. The more we understand about this period, the more we can work to heal the lasting wounds of the Congo Free State and contribute to a more just world. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to share this video, subscribe, and leave a comment to continue the conversation. Let's never forget the victims of the Congo Free State. Their stories must be heard.